two populations, separated by over 12,000 miles of ocean, one forged in the furnace of West African kingdoms, the other shaped by 60,000 years of isolation on the most ancient continent on Earth. On the surface, they seem to have nothing in common. Different languages, different traditions, different histories. And yet, when scientists ran their DNA through some of the most advanced genetic sequencing technology ever built, what came back stopped the room, because buried inside both of their genomes, inside Black Americans and Indigenous Australians, were fingerprints, ancient, shared, undeniable fingerprints, pointing to a connection so deep that it does not just rewrite what we know about these two peoples, it rewrites what we know about all of humanity. Before we dive in, comment where you are watching from and click subscribe. To understand this story, you have to understand what scientists were actually trying to do when they started mapping the genomes of these two populations. In 2016, an international consortium of geneticists, working out of institutions including the Wellcome Sanger Institute in the United Kingdom, the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Germany, and the Australian National University, began the most comprehensive genomic analysis of Aboriginal Australians ever attempted. They sequenced the complete genetic information of 83 Aboriginal Australians and 25 Papuans. Not just snippets, not just markers, full genomes, billions of base pairs per individual. Published in the journal Nature, it was a landmark moment in population genetics. On the other side of the equation, researchers had already spent years building one of the most detailed pictures of African American DNA ever constructed. Studies published in the journal Genome Biology used high-density SNP genotyping data from 136 African Americans, comparing them against 94 indigenous Africans from diverse linguistic and geographic groups, including Mandinka, Yoruba, Biaka Pygmy, Mbuti Pygmy, and San populations. What these researchers were mapping was the African root system from which virtually every Black American descends. The goal was never to find a link between Black Americans and Aboriginal Australians. That was not the hypothesis. That was not the prediction. But science does not always give you what you are looking for. Sometimes it gives you something bigger. Here's where the story gets extraordinary. Every human being on Earth inherits mitochondrial DNA, often called mtDNA, exclusively from their mother. It passes from mother to daughter to granddaughter, unchanged for thousands of years, like a biological timestamp. Scientists organize these maternal lineages into groups called haplogroups. Think of haplogroups like branches on a family tree, except this family tree goes back hundreds of thousands of years. The most common mtDNA haplogroups in Black Americans, drawn directly from their West and Central African ancestry, are haplogroup L0, L1, L2, and L3. Published in PubMed Central, a sample of 343 African American individuals showed 17 distinct haplogroups, with L2A being the most common at nearly 20%, followed by L1B at over 10%. These are deep, ancient African lineages. Now here's the jaw-dropping part. Haplogroup L3, one of the most critical lineages carried by Black Americans, is not just a West African signature. According to Wikipedia's Human Mitochondrial DNA haplogroup entry, backed by multiple peer-reviewed sources, L3 is the haplogroup from which all modern humans outside of Africa ultimately descend. Every European, every East Asian, every Indigenous American, and yes, every Indigenous Australian. Think about what that means. When you trace the maternal line of an Aboriginal Australian all the way back through haplogroups M and N, which branched off approximately 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, you arrive at haplogroup L3. The same lineage sits in the mitochondria of Black Americans right now. Not as a metaphor, not as a symbol, as a literal biological fact. A woman, a real woman, carrying haplogroup L3, living in East Africa between 60,000 and 70,000 years ago, is the maternal great-grandmother of both populations. The ancestors of Black Americans stayed in Africa, refined those L3 lineages into the rich diversity of sub-haplogroups we see today. The ancestors of Aboriginal Australians left Africa, traveled along the southern coast of Asia, crossed ancient land bridges, and arrived in Sahul, the ancient supercontinent that would become Australia, at least 55,000 years ago. Two branches, one root, one mother. But the shared DNA story doesn't stop at ancient maternal lineages. It gets more specific, more visible, more personal. For decades, scientists puzzled over one of the most striking visual facts in human biology. Why do indigenous Australians, a population that left Africa 60,000 years ago and has been isolated on a continent 12,000 miles away, share the same deep, rich melanin pigmentation as West Africans? The two populations look, in some striking ways, remarkably similar. Dark skin, tightly coiled or curled hair, broad features. Scientists called it one of the great mysteries of human physical variation. The old theory was convergent evolution, that Aboriginal Australians independently evolved darker skin because Australia, like equatorial Africa, is a high ultraviolet environment, and dark skin protects against DNA damage from ultraviolet radiation. It made logical sense. Two groups in high ultraviolet zones, both naturally selecting for melanin. Simple. Then a landmark study led by Dr. Sarah Tishkoff at the University of Pennsylvania, published in Science, overturned that theory. Tishkoff's team used a color meter to measure the skin pigmentation of more than 2,000 Africans from ethnically and genetically diverse populations. They then analyzed the specific genes responsible for those pigmentation levels. And when they compared those genetic variants to indigenous Australians and Melanesians, the results were clear. Dr. Tishkoff said, "Some have argued it is because of convergent evolution that they independently evolved these mutations, but our study finds that at genes associated with skin color, they have the identical variants associated with dark skin as Africans. Not similar variants, not parallel variants, the identical variants. The exact same genetic instructions for producing melanin sitting in the genomes of people separated by 60,000 years and 12,000 miles of ocean." The team's conclusion was that this shared pigmentation signature is consistent with an early migration of modern humans out of Africa along the southern coastal route into Australo-Melanesia, and that these populations retain the original African dark skin genetics rather than independently evolving them. The dark skin shared between Black Americans and Aboriginal Australians is not a coincidence. It is inheritance. Before we go further, if this kind of deep history fires you up, if you want to understand where all of us really come from before geography divided us, hit subscribe. This channel goes places most history channels won't touch, and we're just getting started. Now let's talk about what happened to the indigenous Australian branch of this ancient African family after they arrived in Sahul. According to the landmark Cambridge University study published in Nature, Aboriginal Australians and Papuans split from Europeans and Asians at least 51,000 to 58,000 years ago. Then approximately 37,000 years ago, the ancestral Australian population began differentiating into distinct subgroups, with the formation of the Central Desert likely acting as a natural barrier to migration. And then something almost miraculous happened. They stayed. They didn't leave. They didn't get replaced by outside populations. For tens of thousands of years, the indigenous Australian genome was essentially sealed. The 2023 study published in Nature, led by scientists at the Australian National University's National Centre for Indigenous Genomics, confirmed this by analysing the complete genomes of 159 indigenous Australians from 4 remote communities. What they found was staggering. The DNA differences between indigenous Australians living in the Tiwi Islands versus those in the Central Desert were equivalent to comparing the genetic information of someone from Bangladesh to someone from the United Kingdom. Extreme internal diversity across one continent was preserved in near-perfect isolation for 50,000 years. And this diversity, scientists described it as containing a level of genetic variation not observed anywhere else in the world outside of Africa. Outside of Africa, the continent from which their ancestors came, the continent where Black Americans' ancestors stayed. two populations sitting at the genetic extremes of human diversity, one in place, one in diaspora, both carrying signatures of the same original African source. The ANU researchers found more than 160,000 genetic structural variants in the indigenous Australian genome, and up to 62% of them had never been documented anywhere in the scientific literature before. 12% of structural variants appear to be completely exclusive to Indigenous Australians. This is a genome that has preserved things the rest of the world has lost. But here is where the story adds a twist that almost nobody talks about. When the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians were making their epic journey out of Africa and across ancient Asia towards Sahul, they were not alone. They encountered another human species, Denisovan. The Denisovans were an archaic group of hominins related to Neanderthals who lived across Asia for hundreds of thousands of years before dying out around 40,000 years ago. We know about them primarily from a fragment of finger bone and a few teeth discovered in Siberia's Denisova cave. From that single finger bone, scientists extracted an entire genome, and what they found was that the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians, unlike almost any other population on Earth, interbred with the Denisovans. This was a rare connection. Significantly, according to peer-reviewed research on Denisovan introgression, Aboriginal Australians and Papuans carry approximately 4% Denisovan DNA in their genomes. A further 2024 study found that 78 Denisovan gene segments in Aboriginal Australian and Papuan genomes appear to have been positively selected, meaning evolution kept them because they were useful. These Denisovan genes were helping their human carriers survive. What does this mean? It means Aboriginal Australians are the living descendants, not just of the first modern humans to leave Africa, but of an ancient interbreeding event with a species of human that no longer exists. They carry a genome that is literally more complex than any other population outside of Africa, layered with African ancestry, ancient Asian migration, and Denisovan DNA. And their closest genetic relatives in terms of ancient origin? Sub-Saharan Africans, the same populations from which Black Americans come. Here's the part of this story that is not about genetics, but it is just as important, because when you understand the ancient biological kinship between Black Americans and Indigenous Australians, what happened to both of them in the modern era becomes almost impossible to look at without feeling something shift inside you. Black Americans descended from West Africans who were enslaved, ripped from their homelands, transported across the Atlantic in conditions of horror, stripped of their languages, their names, their family structures, and their cultures. For 250 years, their labor built one of the most powerful nations on Earth. Then for another 150 years after emancipation, they were systematically excluded from the wealth they helped create. Indigenous Australians were invaded by British colonizers in 1788. Their land, which their ancestors had stewarded for 55,000 years, was seized. Their children were forcibly removed from their families in what became known as the Stolen Generations. Their languages were suppressed. Their ceremonies were banned. Their elders were killed. By the early 20th century, some government officials were openly predicting, and in some cases actively engineering, what they called the dying out of Aboriginal peoples. Two peoples, descended from the same ancient African mother, both subjected to systems designed to erase them, both surviving. And this is where the epigenetics becomes the most heartbreaking and most remarkable part of this story. Epigenetics is the science of how experience changes the way your genes are expressed without changing the genes themselves. Think of it like this. Your DNA is a piano. Epigenetics determines which keys get played. Trauma can silence keys. Resilience can reopen them. And what is now established in peer-reviewed science is that these epigenetic changes can be passed down, written into the bodies of children who never experienced the original trauma directly. Research from the Journal of Clinical Epigenetics has documented what scientists now call intergenerational resilience in Black Americans, describing it as a continuum of responses within the context of family, community, and religious beliefs. As a consequence of intergenerational exposures to 250 years of chattel slavery, followed by 150 years of systemic discrimination, this resilience has ameliorated but not eliminated the impact of this trauma over approximately 16 generations of exposure. In Australia, researchers and indigenous community leaders have arrived at an almost identical framework, recognizing intergenerational trauma from colonial policies as a biological as well as cultural reality. A 2026 paper published in Science, Technology, and Human Values noted that both Australian indigenous scientists and scholars studying Black American epigenetics have identified a profound resonance between their findings. That environments of chronic trauma and racism literally get under the skin, reshaping gene expression across generations. But here's what the scientists also found: cultural connection, belonging to a community, knowing your history, practicing your traditions, acts as a buffer. Research in Australia found that indigenous people who were intensely practicing their culture experienced significantly lower allostatic load, the physiological burden of chronic stress, even in the face of ongoing racism. Similar findings have emerged in Black American communities, where strong racial identity and community bonds correlate with measurably better health outcomes. The genome that survived 55,000 years of isolation in the Australian desert, the genome that survived the Middle Passage, both carrying the same ancient African inheritance, both healing in community, in culture, in memory. Now let's pull back to the widest view possible, because this is where the science becomes something close to philosophy. The landmark Cambridge study confirmed what geneticists had long suspected. All present-day non-African populations descend from the same single wave of migrants who left Africa approximately 72,000 years ago. One group, one exodus, one origin, but the African populations who stayed, who became the Yoruba, the Igbo, the Mandinka, the Bantu-speaking peoples, they did not just sit still. They evolved. They diversified. They produced more genetic variation within sub-Saharan Africa than exists in all of the rest of the world combined. When you look at the total genetic diversity of humanity, Africa contains the majority of it. Europe, Asia, the Americas, and Australia are all genetic subsets of Africa. What this means is that Black Americans, carrying deep West and Central African ancestry, are, in a specific and measurable biological sense, closer to the common root of all humanity than any non-African population on Earth. And Indigenous Australians, the oldest continuous civilization outside of Africa, preserving in isolation a genome that the rest of the world's migration scrambled and diluted, are themselves a living archive of what early human genetic diversity looked like at the moment our species first left the continent. They are not distant from each other. They are the two poles of one ancient family. One branch stayed in Africa, built civilizations on the banks of rivers from the Niger to the Congo, and their descendants were eventually scattered across the New World in chains. But the DNA survived. The other branch walked out of Africa 60,000 years before the concept of nations existed, crossed seas and deserts, arrived at the edge of the world and stayed, and the DNA survived. Survival. That is what the science keeps coming back to. Both populations have been subjected to deliberate, systematic, catastrophic attempts to erase them, and both are still here. And both are still carrying in every cell of their bodies the original code of the species. So what do we do with this information? First, we understand that the categories we use to divide humanity, race, ethnicity, nation, continent, are, geologically speaking, brand new. The genetic distance between a Black American from Atlanta and an Indigenous Australian from the Northern Territory is, in evolutionary terms, almost nothing. They share a common maternal haplogroup ancestor who lived 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. By contrast, the genetic divergence between different subspecies of chimpanzees is far greater than any divergence between any two groups of human beings. Second, we understand that the story of humanity is not a story of separate origins that converged. It is a story of one origin that diverged, and that every human population alive today is a chapter in that same book, written in the same biological language, beginning on the same continent. Third, we understand that when two of the most marginalized, most historically targeted populations on Earth, Black Americans and Indigenous Australians, are revealed to be among the oldest and most genetically significant branches of the human family, that is not a footnote. That is the headline. That is the story. The science does not rank populations. It does not create hierarchies. But it does reveal something that politics and history have spent centuries trying to obscure, that the people who have been treated as the least valuable are the carriers of the most ancient human inheritance on the planet. A woman lived in East Africa between 60,000 and 70,000 years ago. She carried haplogroup L3 in the mitochondria of her cells. She had children. Her children had children. Some of those descendants stayed in Africa, and their lineages became the Yoruba and the Igbo and the Akan and the Bantu peoples. And eventually, through one of the most brutal chapters in human history, their descendants became Black Americans. Others left. They walked south and east along a coastal route, crossing ancient land bridges, following the receding sea, until one group found themselves on the edge of a continent that no human had ever stood on before. And they stayed for 55,000 years. And their descendants became the Aboriginal Australians. The DNA in a Black American man in Chicago and an Aboriginal Australian woman in the Northern Territory both carry that woman's ancient signature, not symbolically, not poetically, literally. We are not different species that happen to end up in different places. We are one species, one origin, one story, told in different languages on different continents over a time span that makes all of recorded human history look like the last paragraph of a very long book. That's what the DNA says, and the DNA does not lie. If this video changed the way you see the world even slightly, share it, because these are the stories that do not get told in textbooks. Subscribe if you want to keep going down this road.